Alright, it's MOvember, and what I wanted to do is go over the addictive system that Patrick Carnes talks about in Facing Addiction, and you'll find it also in the sex addiction literature of Facing the Shadow and Facing the Cross. So let me take you through this. If you're suffering from an addiction, most people come into treatment and they want to stop acting out. That's the main thing, and that's what they're aware of. Now, it could be something, what you're looking for, if you know, the most common asked question is it an addiction or is it just an abuse issue? And so largely that's what we are looking for, is this something that I'm using? Is this something that I'm abusing? Or is this something that is an addiction for me? And so to keep it really simple when it comes to addiction, is you're going to see a criteria being met. A therapist really is going to look for 5 key things. Is there impaired control? Is there compulsive use? Is there continued use in spite of consequence? Is there the phenomenon of craving? And largely we'll see that in the existence of withdrawal and tolerance issues. And is there the element of denial? Now, addiction is a disease that tells you that it hasn't got a disease, and its most striking manifestation is the addict's ability to minimize use and consequence, but that's the most baffling to others. So if you're working with an addict in a stage of change that might be pre-contemplative, they're still going to have people around them that are baffled: fathers, mothers, partners, adult children, and so we can work with that. But essentially, we're trying to break through delusion and denial. So, if you come in and you've realised, let's say that you hit that addiction criteria, and you come in and you say, look, I need to stop acting out. Well, what I want to go through now is an addictive system that is essential to understand if you want to get to recovery. Now, I've gone over for MOvember the recovery system, so let's get clear on what the addictive system is and see how we go. So, the addictive system, it starts with the core beliefs. Now, these are those beliefs that might have formed earlier in our life, and they're the I am beliefs. And the most common one I would say is I am not good enough, I am unlovable, I am not worthy. Really going back in someone's story and trying to find out and identify what are those, what can largely be minimized or unconscious beliefs. If you asked me when I went to detox what my family was like, I would have said Dad worked for Qantas, I went for South Sydney, I played soccer, I like rock and roll, and I was the black sheep of the family. It wasn't until a few years into recovery when I met a good therapist that could help me understand what was happening in my life, and I was able to identify with codependency, which is simply best described by its symptoms, and it is the evidence of developmental trauma in your life. So these core beliefs generate a discomfort, an inability to regulate how we feel, and that's the heart and core of addiction. Now, to maintain an addiction, I have to have impaired thinking. So, yeah, there was a period of my time in my using where I used to have a t-shirt that said "drinking problem?" ? I get drunk, I fall down, no problem. And largely for addicts, I don't see, as I sort of fall into that addictive cycle, that I've got a problem. But my impaired thinking is the doorway in. Now, impaired thinking for an addict will be one won't hurt, or if I just smoke pot and don't use heroin, if I just look at porn and don't have an affair, if I just eat on the weekend and not eat through the week. If you've got an addiction and meet that criteria, that thinking is largely insane. And as Pia Mellody says in her Step 2 literature, self-defeating to the point of insanity. So this impaired thinking, we've got to get really clear in our recovery. What are my beliefs that lead me into the addictive cycle? So this addictive system leads me into it. So that impaired thinking has to be deconstructed. And we have to then, in the recovery cycle, find some empowered thinking. So for an addict that used to think, look, it's, you know, everyone gets drunk, it's Christmas, it's Anzac Day, it's my birthday. When you replace that with one too many is 1,000 never enough, that is a paradigm shift. But what we need to do is find out, what is my impaired thinking? What are the secrets or promises to self that I tell myself that give me permission to go into the cycle? Now, once I can have enough impaired thinking going on, I'll go into that preoccupation phase. Now, what you're looking for there is anything where we go into fantasy about our addiction, and what that will cause is euphoric recall. Now, euphoric recall is the enemy to the addict. And if you go to any decent rehab, the therapist will really support the community not to neg rave, sit around and glorify and glamorize the old stories. It's something that we know now triggers the reward system in the brain. If I get that seed, that thought that I want to act out, doesn't matter if it's food, sex, drugs, gambling, work, etc. Once I start to go into obsession, it activates the brain's reward system. And I'll talk about that more in a second. Now, this preoccupation, this euphoric recall, will then head us in the direction of our rituals for addiction. Now, this is something that also has to get unpacked. Now, in the 12-step literature, they get us looking for people, and they get us looking for places, and they get us looking for things that will trigger our addiction. Now, one of the criteria of addiction is craving. Now, when you're in periods of abstinence, and I see people get confused about this all the time, in a period of abstinence, you can lose the craving for whatever it is that you're addicted to. So sometimes when people get sober and they're in early recovery, they think, well, wow, I mightn't even be an addict. I don't even crave it anymore. I've put it down and it's gone. But what we do know is that using any amount of that substance can trigger the craving, or people, places and things associated with the addiction can trigger the craving. So largely in the 12-step culture, they'll get you to really put some bottom lines around old people, places and things. So we need to get well from addiction, I need to be really clear. Who is it? You know, addiction is a very tangible thing. I'm going to have a telephone with dealers' numbers in it. I'm going to have laptops if I'm a sex addict that's going to have access to pornography. I'm going to have certain places that I go that are trigger. If you're an alcoholic, going into a place that sells alcohol can largely be a very dangerous situation in early recovery, and we need to avoid it. A sex addict mightn't go to the beach in the middle of summer because they're just too triggered. They mightn't go to the mall at peak times because they're too triggered. They start to objectify and go into fantasy. So for us to get well, we really need to be clear on what I do. This cycle has to be personal to you for it to work. So in the addiction system is that I have these core beliefs that drive the impaired thinking that allows me to go into this fantasy. I'm in euphoric recall, and already now my central nervous system, my brain's reward system is active. The chemicals in it have changed. I'm now full of adrenaline, full of dopamine, full of serotonin. I'm excited. Even sometimes cortisol if you know you're going back into the danger zone. So rituals then lead to the acting out. So whatever it is, and Patrick Carnes makes the point in his general path literature that from some of the research they did that 87% of people, if you have one addiction, you've got two or more. What I understand about that now is largely the brain's reward system doesn't care what triggers it. You can have a whole variety of sources, and you can say be an alcoholic, go to treatment, but you're still smoking and gambling and sexually acting out, and you can put down the alcohol. Life will improve around alcohol, but of real happiness you'll find none. Once in this sort of addiction cycle, we act out, and if you're meeting that criteria of addiction, you feel really good when you do it, but after it, we go into the shame cycle. We'll feel shame, despair, guilt, numb, disconnected. But what happens at that point, and there's some literature and studies from Harvard that say that the brain needs to equilibriumize. It is hardwired to seek pleasure. So once we hit a peak moment of the stress, the very thing that you are doing that caused you this pain becomes the very thing that our brain starts to focus on again, and back we go into preoccupation, back we go into euphoric recall. I know that'll make me feel better, and around we go. And the thing that is difficult for people in recovery is to accept that we have to really clean up our act. Just stopping's not enough. Abstinence on its own is not enough. Now, if you're in this cycle for any period of time, you will lead to and have evidence of unmanageability. It's going to cost us money. It's going to affect our work performance. It's going to affect all our relationships. It's going to affect us spiritually in regards to how we experience ourselves. it will affect every area of our life eventually. Now, some addictions are really compartmentalized and tucked away and can exist for a long period of time. You're nearly lucky if you've got alcohol or drugs. Now, that's going to be a crazy thing, but it's such a tangible, observable experience when people are wasted on drugs and alcohol, where a sex addict or a workaholic can win awards for that obsession and compulsion. And a sex addict can largely can put it underground, and people can not find out about it for many years, but the person suffers. It suffers at the hands of addiction. So to the addictive cycle, the core issues lead to the impaired thinking. It tricks us down and triggers us into the addictive cycle, which is the preoccupation, fantasy, euphoric recall. We go into our rituals, the people, places and things, we act out, we feel like crap, we can get lost down there for a while, and then we get this evidence of unmanageability. Now, the last thing I just want to say on this that I think is something I see in treatment all the time is that you'll watch people come in and we pretty well split this thing in two. Now, you can go to a 12-step meeting and the only desire for membership to participate is, the only requirement is the desire to stop. You don't have to stop. You can be in an AA meeting next to someone who's drinking. You can be in a gambling meeting next to someone listening to the races. It's not the spirit of the fellowship, but it's okay. That's what can happen. So what happens in recovery is that you can go to a meeting and they'll say, Pete, would you like to share? And Pete says, yeah, sure. Look, I'm glad I'm here at the meeting. I'm going to ask for help over here. Had a bad week. I acted out this week and it felt terrible. I felt a lot of shame and guilt. My work performance dropped. My boss told me to go home. My relationship is in jeopardy as a result of it. I'm really glad I'm here. I'm glad I can tell you guys and be honest. And everyone claps and says, thanks very much, Pete, for sharing. Essentially, Pete, though, is still struggling in the cycle of addiction. He's not really sure what's going on. He just knows that he's acted out, he feels like crap, and life's unmanageable. The people that get well, that live on the other side of this line, and they've got a really clear understanding of what their addiction looks like. So then they might ask Susie, would you like to share? And she says, yeah, I'd love to share. Geez, this week was a really rough week. I noticed that I had a work performance issue, and my boss was talking to me about a project. I didn't do that well, and it really triggered a core belief that I'm not good enough. And when that happened, my head was saying, well, look, one won't hurt, and I started to go into fantasy about that one. I thought, well, if I just go down to the bar at lunchtime and just have one stiff drink, I'll feel better for that interview that I've got to have. And that's when I freaked out. And at that point, I asked for help. And I rang my sponsor and I reached out. My sponsor said the Serenity Prayer over the phone with me, got me to read the first step, do a little bit of journaling on it. I went to a meeting that night, and I've gone to some extra meetings this week. I've done some more outreach calls. I've worked the steps over it, and I'm really glad I'm here tonight to share that. And so if we know about this addiction and we're really clear that when we start the red flags start to drop, I'm in the impaired thinking, the core beliefs are active, I'm in that euphoric recall, if we can ask for help over there, you can leave that room and never use again. So I hope this has been useful. You'll find it, as I said, in the resource Facing Addiction by Patrick Carnes. Find yourself an addiction specialist if you can that understands this. Really get a clear understanding of not just the acting out behaviour, but what leads to it. Hope this has been helpful. Please donate to MOvember campaign. Take care.